Elias Hartwell arrived in the township without the noise of a welcome, a boy of 10 whose eyes seemed to notice things that should not be noticed. His origins were a mystery, his past never spoken of, and those who tried to ask soon gave up, unsettled by the way his gaze lingered too long as if taking careful measurements. Margaret Bly, a widow with a reputation for charity, took him in without question, believing that the boy's silence came from grief. It was a mistake she would never have the chance to undo. From the first days in her care, Elias gravitated toward paper and charcoal as though they were the only language he knew. He would sit for hours at the kitchen table, head bent, his thin hand moving in slow, deliberate strokes, pausing every so often as if listening to something only he could hear. The images he produced were precise and unsettling, not grotesque in subject but in detail, as though copied from life. He drew sprawling cemeteries with names on headstones he could not have known. He sketched crossroads where gallows stood, though the nearest execution scaffold was many miles away. Most chilling were his graveyards, each with distinctive trees, leaning stones, and angles of light that felt impossibly real, like captured memories of places never seen. At first, the townsfolk found it strange in the way people sometimes tolerate oddities in children. They passed his sketches around at gatherings, remarking on his gift for accuracy despite never leaving the township. Some even claimed the boy might have a future as an illustrator. But Margaret began to notice something no one else was counting. Each time Elias finished a drawing, something small in the village turned up dead. A robin with its wings stretched and pinned neatly into the dirt as though displayed for study. A rabbit with its eyes closed, paws folded as if at prayer. A cat with its body bent in a perfect arc, its tail placed across its mouth. No marks of violence were obvious, but the arrangements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if someone had prepared them for an unseen audience. Margaret tried to dismiss it as coincidence, yet the timing was too precise to ignore. The day Elias finished his sketch of a narrow lane lined with crooked willow trees, she found a squirrel laid beneath one, its tiny limbs bound with twine. When she asked him about it, he looked at her not with confusion but with a calm that suggested she had asked the wrong question. He neither admitted nor denied, and in that silence she felt the first flicker of fear, though she could not have explained why. There was nothing frantic in his manner, nothing of the cruelty that village men might blame on wild boys. Elias's work was slow, clean, and entirely without anger, as though death was not an act to him but an arrangement, one that began on paper and ended in the stillness of the real. Soon she noticed another detail that gnawed at her. Before Elias began a drawing, he always studied the blank page for a long time, tracing invisible lines in the air. He would work with a steady hand, but his expression would change only after the last stroke, as if something inside him had been satisfied. The animals appeared soon after, already dead, posed in a way that matched the composition or spirit of the latest sketch. She could not explain it to herself without thinking of it as a ritual. Creation before destruction, as though drawing was his permission to kill. The village, still ignorant of the connection, continued to treat Elias as a strange but harmless ward of the kindly widow. He was pale, thin, and well-mannered, and his quietness gave the impression of goodness. No one noticed the precision with which he observed the world, storing details like a craftsman choosing materials. But Margaret saw. She saw it in the way his gaze lingered on a particular bend in the road, the way he traced the silhouette of a barn with his eyes, and the way his fingers moved against the table when he thought no one was looking, as though rehearsing lines on an unseen page. She began to dread the sound of his chair scraping back from the table, the slow folding of his sketchbook, and the soft, almost reverent placing of charcoal beside it. These moments meant the drawing was done, and somewhere in the village something living would soon be remade into stillness. What she did not yet know, what she could not imagine, was that the animals were only practice, small rehearsals for larger compositions. The paper had already begun to hold the outlines of people, the angles of limbs that were not his own, the landscapes that would soon become graves. And when the first human body appeared in a pose drawn by Elias Hartwell, it would no longer be possible to dismiss it as coincidence. Under the gray hush of an early spring morning, the township stirred to news that made voices lower and glances turn cautious. Clara Renslow, a miller's daughter no older than 12, had not returned home the previous night. Her absence had first been treated as a childish wander, perhaps a stubborn streak keeping her in the fields past dark. But when her mother's voice cracked through the street at dawn, calling her name with the kind of fear that carries no hope, a search began. The villagers moved in small, uneasy groups, spreading toward the riverbanks where the thawing ice whispered against the shore. It was there, just beyond the bend where the reeds grew tall and brittle, that they found her. She was lying on the cold mud as though placed there with care, arms crossed neatly over her chest, fingers curled around a handful of dried wildflowers, her dress smoothed as if by a mother's hand. Her eyes were closed, lips parted slightly as though caught in the final note of a song. The coroner declared it a drowning, simple and tragic. Yet something in the arrangement unsettled those who looked too long. Margaret Bly stood among the watchers, the February wind biting at her shawl, her stomach tightening in a way she could not name. She had seen this before. Not the girl herself, but the image. 2 weeks earlier, Elias had sat at her kitchen table sketching a scene of the creek in uncanny detail. In his drawing, the water ran low, the reeds bent in the same direction, and in the center lay a girl, arms crossed, mouth slightly open, wildflowers pressed into her hands. Margaret had told herself it was just a strange coincidence that Elias could not have known. But standing there now, with the river scent thick in the air and the girl lying in the mud exactly as he had imagined, the memory of that sketch pressed against her mind like a cold hand. She returned home that day with a heaviness she could not shake, finding Elias in his usual place, bent over a fresh page. His hand moved with its familiar precision, the charcoal whispering across the paper. Margaret tried to look away, but her eyes caught the shape of what he was creating. A narrow field bordered by leaning fence posts, and in the center something human-shaped. Her throat closed. She wondered if anyone else would see what she saw, or if they would only praise his skill and leave the truth to rot in the dark. The village would bury Clara Renslow in a simple ceremony, never suspecting that her death had been drawn before it happened. And Elias, pale and silent, would be there among the mourners, his eyes resting on the coffin as though confirming that his work had been faithfully reproduced in flesh. The weeks after Clara's burial were heavy with the kind of silence that creeps into a town after a tragedy. People spoke her name softly, as if sound itself might disturb her grave. But in Margaret Bly's house, the quiet was sharper, more deliberate, as if the walls themselves were listening. Elias continued to draw each day, his posture calm, his movements unhurried. Yet there was a new precision in his work, a narrowing of focus that unsettled Margaret. He no longer filled pages with wide landscapes or distant graveyards. Now his sketches were tighter, centered on singular figures. At first they were vague shapes, human outlines without faces, but as the days passed, the features sharpened. One afternoon, while scrubbing the kitchen floor, Margaret noticed Elias seated by the window, sketchbook propped on his knees. The light caught his face in a way that made his eyes appear almost colorless. She paused her work, drawn toward the page in his lap. The figure he was drawing was no stranger. It was Thomas Hale, the blacksmith's apprentice, right down to the crooked set of his jaw and the tear in his left sleeve. But the likeness was not the most disturbing part. Thomas in the sketch was lying on the ground, his neck twisted at an impossible angle, a scattering of nails arranged in a perfect circle around his head like a cruel halo. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas was alive. She'd seen him just that morning carrying a barrel into the forge. She told herself not to interfere, not to accuse without proof, but the thought clung to her through the night. 2 days later, word spread that Thomas had been found dead in an alley behind the smithy. His neck was broken, and the blacksmith, shaking with grief, said the boy's head had been surrounded by a pattern of nails, as though someone had taken time to arrange them before leaving the body. The sheriff called it a robbery gone wrong, but Margaret's knees went weak when she heard. She went home, climbed the stairs to Elias's small room, and found the sketch on his desk, exactly as she had seen it before, the page still smudged from his fingertips. She stared at the drawing for a long time, feeling something shift inside her, fear giving way to a cold, creeping certainty. This was no gift of foresight, no strange coincidence. These images were blueprints. Elias was not seeing the future, he was building it piece by piece, stroke by careful stroke. And as she closed the door behind her, Margaret understood the truth that would keep her awake at night. Whatever he chose to draw next was already doomed. Margaret began watching him more closely, not in the way one watches a child for mischief, but in the way a hunter watches something dangerous move in the brush, quiet, deliberate, waiting for its next sign. Elias never seemed rushed. He moved through the house like a shadow with purpose, pausing at windows, studying corners of streets when they walked to the market, turning his head just enough to take in a stranger's face. She realized then that the sketch never came from his mind alone. He was collecting pieces, storing them, an angle of light, the slump of a man's shoulders, the curve of a worn boot. It was all part of the preparation. And when his hand finally met the page, the subject was already chosen. One cold morning she brought in laundry from the line and found him at the kitchen table, a blank sheet before him. He didn't look at her when she passed, but she felt the weight of something in the air, as if the drawing was already there, invisible, waiting to emerge. His fingers traced faint paths in the empty space, pausing over certain spots, tapping lightly. Hours later, she returned to find the shape of a face forming. This time she recognized it instantly. Mary Kavanagh, the baker's wife, with her hair tied back and her apron speckled from kneading bread. But in the drawing, Mary was lying across her own kitchen floor, one hand submerged in a mixing bowl filled not with dough but with something dark and glistening. Beside her head, a loaf of bread rested neatly, its crust slashed open like a wound. Margaret's hands trembled, but she said nothing. That night the scent of baking drifted through the town as it always did, but by morning the smell had turned to something bitter. Mary Kavanagh was found lifeless on her kitchen floor, her head angled toward a mixing bowl filled with her own blood. The loaf of bread sat exactly as in Elias's sketch, its crust marked with deliberate cuts that revealed nothing inside. The sheriff spoke of a break-in, perhaps an act of vengeance. But Margaret didn't need explanations. She had seen it drawn before it happened. When she returned home, Elias was already seated again, the last page of his sketchbook filled. He was starting another without hesitation, as if one death was only a stepping stone to the next. And as Margaret stood in the doorway, staring at the motion of his hand, she felt a chill worse than grief. The paper was no longer just a surface for his art, it was a threshold, and every time he crossed it, someone on the other side would not return. It was then that Margaret began searching for his work in secret, waiting until Elias left the house to run an errand for the parish or to wander along the edge of the woods. She would slip into his small upstairs room, her pulse loud in her ears, and leaf through the stack of worn sketchbooks on the desk. Most were filled with the same chilling precision, people she knew frozen in poses no living body could hold. Sometimes the backgrounds were vague, as if only the subject mattered. Other times the surroundings were drawn with surgical clarity, like instructions to recreate the scene exactly. But one book she found tucked beneath the others was different. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the edges singed as though they had been too close to fire. Here the drawings were not of faces or places, they were of bodies opened like diagrams, each organ removed and replaced with something unnatural. Stones carved into smooth ovals, bundles of twigs bound with thread, small glass jars filled with pale liquid. Every figure was labeled with tiny, neat writing, the words compressed into tight rows that Margaret couldn't fully read. It wasn't English, nor was it any script she recognized from the church or the newspapers. This book felt older than Elias, older than the house itself, as if he had only added to it rather than begun it. Some drawings were accompanied by numbers, precise measurements next to ribs and femurs, as though he were refining something over time. Margaret's hands shook as she turned the last page and found something that made her skin crawl. A single unfinished sketch of a woman sitting by a window, sewing. Her hair was pinned in the way Margaret often wore hers. The lines of her face were already there, faint but unmistakable. But what froze her wasn't the recognition. It was the fact that her eyes in the sketch were nothing but dark, empty holes in the page, burned clean through by something sharp and hot. She slammed the book shut and pushed it back under the pile before she could think. Her breath came in shallow pulls as she backed out of the room, listening for his footsteps on the stairs. When Elias returned later, she tried to meet his gaze, but there was something in the way he looked at her now. A quiet acknowledgement, as though he knew she had touched something that wasn't meant for her. That night she lay awake in the cold, the image of herself with hollow eyes fixed in her mind. Somewhere in the darkness of the next day she knew that sketch would be finished, and when it was, the world would follow it exactly. The morning came without sunlight, the clouds hanging low and swollen, and Margaret felt the air inside the house was heavier than the storm outside. Elias sat at the table already, sketchbook open, his posture straighter than usual. His hand moved without pause, and she knew without looking that her likeness was taking shape on that page. Every sound in the house seemed sharpened. The scrape of the charcoal, the faint ticking of the mantel clock, her own heartbeat quickening in her ears. She busied herself with the fire, with the bread, with anything that kept her from meeting his eyes, but she could feel his gaze flicker toward her between strokes, measuring, checking. It was the attention of a craftsman nearing completion. By noon, she could not bear the weight any longer. She stepped outside, telling him she was fetching wood from the shed. But instead, she made her way to the neighboring farm. Joseph Kettner was a broad-shouldered man with a quiet manner, and he listened without interrupting as Margaret told him, carefully and without detail, that she feared Elias was unwell, dangerous even. But when she tried to explain how the sketches came before the deaths, the words sounded unsteady in her own mouth. Joseph's frown was polite but unconvinced. He said the boy had been through much and that such fancies were born of grief. By the time she returned home, the air inside felt colder. Elias was gone, but his sketchbook remained on the table open to her completed portrait. It was worse than the unfinished one. Her eyes were not only burned through, but the hollows had been smeared with ash, staining the paper as if the absence itself had weight. Around her head, Elias had drawn a ring of small, delicate shapes she could not immediately name. She leaned closer and felt her stomach twist. They were bird skulls, arranged like a crown. That night, she locked her bedroom door for the first time since Elias had come to live with her. Sleep came in restless scraps, each time broken by the faint sensation of movement in the hallway. Just before dawn, she woke to a silence so deep it felt unnatural, and in that silence came the softest sound. Paper turning, slow and deliberate, from somewhere beyond the door. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard nothing else, but she did not open it. She understood in a way she could not explain that the sketch was only the first step. Whatever followed would not be rushed, and it would not fail. 3 days later, Margaret Bly was found seated upright in her own parlor as if awaiting a guest. Her dress was clean, her hair combed into a neat coil, but her skin had the pale, waxen stillness of the dead. Her hands rested gently in her lap, fingers interlaced, and her eyes, both gone, were nothing but hollow sockets, the edges blackened as though touched by fire. No blood had run, no mess had been left. The work was meticulous, almost surgical, the kind that spoke of time taken without interruption. On the mantel above her, propped between a candlestick and the clock, lay a fresh sheet of paper. The sketch was identical to the scene before it, down to the smallest detail. The fold of her skirt, the tilt of her chin, the dark voids where her eyes had been. But in the drawing, those voids were deeper, endless, as though the charcoal had been rubbed until the page itself thinned toward tearing. The only deviation was the crown of bird skulls upon her drawn head, rendered with such delicate precision that they seemed almost real. The sheriff, a man more familiar with drunken brawls than strange deaths, declared it an unsolved act of trespass and violence. He questioned Elias only briefly, finding nothing in the boy's soft, even voice to suggest guilt. A child, after all, could not have done such a thing without leaving some trace, some mark of force. Elias was sent to the parish orphanage, placed in the care of nuns who welcomed him with the pity reserved for the newly bereaved. The townsfolk mourned Margaret quietly, but the whispers began to turn toward the boy. How he never cried at her funeral, how he stood near the coffin and seemed more absorbed in the shadow it cast on the floor than in the service itself. Some swore they had seen him clutching a folded piece of paper that day, tucking it into his coat before walking away from the grave. Few dared to ask him what was drawn on it. And as the weeks passed, those who noticed Elias sitting alone in the orphanage yard, sketching in the pale winter light, did not linger long enough to see the shapes forming under his hand. They did not want to know who might be next. The parish orphanage was a place meant for order, rows of narrow beds, mealtimes marked by the bell, prayers whispered before and after every task. To the nuns, Elias was a quiet blessing at first. He did not quarrel, did not run in the halls, did not shout like the other boys. He spent his hours in the corner of the study room, sketchbook balanced on his knees, head bent in a posture of obedience. But Sister Agnes, who had a habit of watching without speaking, began to see what others overlooked. The boy's drawings never showed happy scenes or the familiar comfort of the orphanage walls. They were always of the children themselves, rendered in startling accuracy, caught in strange, rigid postures that had no place in play. The first death came in early spring. A boy named Matthew, barely 9, was found in his bed at dawn. His face was serene as though sleeping, but his arms were bent backward from the elbows in a way no living body could endure. His blankets were neatly smoothed, and on the floor beside the bed lay 3 wooden blocks, arranged in a triangle pointing toward the door. The physician called it a seizure, an unfortunate act of nature. Sister Agnes thought of the drawing she had seen 2 days before. Matthew, with that same impossible bend in his arms, the 3 blocks at his side, each marked with careful shading. A month later, another boy was found in the laundry room, hanging upside down from the rafters, his ankles bound with strips of white linen. His eyes were sewn shut with coarse thread, the knots tied so evenly they could have been measured. The nuns were struck dumb with horror, their prayers stumbling into silence as they cut him down. No one spoke of the drawing Elias had made the week before, a perfect rendering of the laundry room from that same angle, the figure suspended in stillness, the stitching at the eyes so precise it could have been traced. Rumors began to ripple through the orphanage, carried in the hushed tones of children who claimed they had seen their own faces in Elias's book. The nuns tried to hush it, fearing panic, but they too began to avoid standing behind him when he worked, and yet no one thought to take away his paper or his charcoal. No one thought to break the ritual that seemed to follow him, from page to body, from creation to destruction. It was only when a man from the city, a physician named Dr. Nathaniel Cross, arrived at the orphanage asking about the strange boy with the gift for drawing, that the pattern began to twist into something darker still. Dr. Nathaniel Cross was not like the parish physicians who tended to coughs and fevers. He was a tall, severe man with eyes that seemed to see past the body and into whatever lay beneath it. He claimed to be studying unusual mental states in children, though he offered no letter from a university and spoke with a certainty that left little room for questioning. The nuns, worn thin by the quiet dread that had settled over the orphanage, welcomed his interest. If Elias was troubled, perhaps the doctor could explain him, even cure him. From the moment they met, there was an unspoken recognition between Elias and Dr. Cross, as if each had found in the other a reflection of something rare and dangerous. Cross asked nothing about Elias's past, nothing about the deaths. Instead, he asked to see his drawings. The boy handed them over without hesitation, and the doctor turned each page slowly, studying them as though they were blueprints rather than art. When he looked up, there was no pity in his gaze, only a thin, approving smile. Over the following weeks, Cross arranged to spend long hours with Elias, often behind the closed door of the study room. He began bringing him gifts. Not toys or books, but fresh sheets of fine paper, high-quality charcoal, and most disturbingly, a small collection of preserved animal specimens sealed in jars. He told the nuns these were for anatomical education. Elias accepted them with the same calm he brought to everything. But Margaret would never have recognized the subtle change in him. The way his drawings grew sharper, more deliberate, as if he had been given tools that matched the scale of his thoughts. Cross began to notice something the others had not. Elias always drew before the death, never after. And when he drew, he did so with a precision that allowed no deviation, as though the final act must match the image exactly. The doctor, rather than fearing this pattern, sought to test it. He began suggesting subjects, planting the seed of an idea without directly giving instruction. Elias never refused, never asked why. He simply observed, absorbed, and when the time came, produced the image exactly as it had lived in Cross's mind. Within a month, a new body was found, this time a stable boy from a nearby estate. The cause of death baffled the authorities, no wounds, no signs of struggle. Yet the body's internal organs were rearranged with the precision of a surgeon, each placed in a configuration impossible to achieve in life. Only Dr. Cross knew that a week earlier, Elias had drawn that very arrangement on a page, labeling each organ in the same manner as the strange, burnt-edged book hidden under his bed. To the nuns, Cross became the boy's guardian in all but name. To Elias, the doctor became something closer. A witness who understood the quiet ritual, who did not question the sequence of creation before destruction, and who saw not evil in his work, but design. The boy had been working alone until now. With Cross, he had an audience, and soon, a partner. Cross's interest soon pushed past the point of observation. One rainy afternoon, when the orphanage was muffled by the steady drumming on its roof, he arrived with a bundle swaddled in oilcloth. Inside was not another animal specimen, but a living subject. A frail woman in her 70s, her breath shallow, her eyes clouded with the dull sheen of someone already close to death. She had been one of Cross's patients in the city, he explained in low, even tones, her mind already slipping beyond recall. The nuns were told she was a charity case in need of quiet care. Only Elias understood what she truly was. Cross placed her in a narrow bed in an unused infirmary room and left Elias there with his sketchbook. The boy studied her for a long while, not sketching immediately, but circling the bed, noting the slope of her shoulders, the way her ribs lifted and fell under the thin blanket. When he finally began, his strokes were certain, unhurried, and what took shape on the page was not the dying woman as she was, but as Elias decided she should be. Her face smoothed of age, her mouth softened into the hint of a smile, a long scar stitched neatly across her chest. Around her he drew small glass jars, each containing something pale and indistinct arranged like sentinels. 3 days later, the woman was found dead. Her skin had been treated with some kind of clear resin that lent it a waxen youth, her features eerily matching those in the drawing. Her chest bore a surgical incision stitched with such perfect uniformity it could have been machine work. And beside her bed, arranged on the floor exactly as depicted, were jars containing her organs, each labeled in Elias's narrow, precise hand. Cross stood over the body with the air of a man inspecting fine craftsmanship, offering no pretense of shock. From that point on, there was no question in the doctor's mind. Elias was not merely predicting death, he was shaping it, bending the final moments of a life into alignment with what he had drawn. The drawing was no record, no passive vision. It was a set of instructions the world seemed compelled to obey. And Cross, who had once been content to study, now found himself thinking of possibilities, of patterns that could be widened and perfected. If one boy could do this, what might be built from it? It was on that same day that Elias began a new page, the lines faint at first but deliberate. A row of narrow beds, each with a child lying still, hands folded over their chests. The scene was unmistakably the orphanage dormitory. Cross did not stop him. He only watched. The night Elias began that drawing, the orphanage seemed to hold its breath. The children were put to bed as usual, unaware of the quiet current running beneath the ordinary routines. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and damp. Sister Agnes made her final rounds, checking the dormitory lamps and murmuring prayers under her breath. Elias lay in his bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, the faintest curve of a thought tugging at the corners of his mouth. In the study room, hidden beneath the top layer of his sketchbook, the nearly finished image of the dormitory waited like a sealed order. The deaths began before dawn. At first there was no sound, just stillness. One boy was found with his arms crossed perfectly over his chest, his head turned toward the window as though listening to something outside. Another lay face down, his back arched unnaturally, his neck rigid. The small, sickly child at the far end of the room was discovered with his mouth sewn shut, the stitches so fine they might have been done by a jeweler. And at the center of the row of beds, 2 boys were positioned in perfect symmetry, hands clasped, legs straight, heads tilted slightly toward each other. Every detail matched the drawing, down to the folds in the blankets. The nuns' screams tore through the morning air, bringing chaos into the halls. Some ran to fetch water, others to the chapel, but nothing could undo what had been set in motion. Cross appeared moments later, calm in the face of panic, his presence almost calculated. He made no effort to comfort the survivors. Instead, he searched for Elias. The boy was not in the dormitory. He was found sitting alone in the study, his sketchbook closed, the charcoal placed neatly beside it. When Cross met his eyes, Elias did not smile, but there was something in the look they shared, a silent acknowledgement that the experiment had moved into a new phase. The official cause of the deaths was left vague. Unknown fever was whispered in reports, though no one could explain the careful arrangements, the absence of struggle, or the unnatural precision of the bodies. The townsfolk heard only fragments, and soon the parish sealed its gates to avoid scandal. By nightfall, the dormitory beds were stripped bare, the walls scrubbed as if erasing the evidence could erase the truth. But the truth was already preserved, in Elias's drawing, in Cross's memory, and in the knowledge that what had happened once could be done again, on a scale the orphanage could not contain. It happened less than a week later. Cross, no longer content with small clusters of deaths, began planning something that would leave no doubt of Elias's reach. He arrived at the orphanage under cover of dusk, carrying a leather satchel not meant for medicine. Inside was a roll of thick, unmarked paper and a set of drafting tools so precise they belonged to an architect. He laid them out before Elias without speaking, and the boy understood. That night, by lamplight, they worked together, Cross describing, Elias translating every word into line and shadow. What emerged on the page was not a single figure, nor even a single room, but an entire building engulfed in flame, its windows alive with the silhouettes of people trapped inside. In the following days, Elias's behavior shifted into a kind of quiet preparation. He walked the halls more slowly, his gaze lingering on beams, door frames, and stairwells as though taking their measurements. He watched the children at play, noting their movements, their positions, the shapes they made together when they clustered in groups. He began filling smaller pages with close-up sketches. A boy's arm bent to shield his eyes, a girl's hair catching the light through smoke. These were not separate works, they were fragments of the larger composition waiting to be made real. On the night it happened, the air was still and unnervingly warm for spring. The nuns retired later than usual, leaving the lamps burning low in the corridors. Sometime after midnight, a thin column of smoke slipped from the storage room at the rear of the orphanage. No one saw Cross moving through the shadows, his steps soundless, nor Elias following close behind with the sketch rolled under his arm. By the time the fire was noticed, it had already swallowed the wooden staircase, trapping most of the children upstairs. Panic turned the building into a hive of desperate movement. But the flames seemed to guide rather than consume, driving the occupants into the precise positions Elias had drawn. By morning, the orphanage was a blackened shell. Its roof collapsed, the air heavy with the stench of char and loss. Most of the children were dead, their bodies found in arrangements too exact to be the work of chaos. Two lay side by side beneath a collapsed beam, hands intertwined. Another knelt upright in a corner, head bowed as though in prayer, untouched by falling debris. Each scene matched a fragment of Elias's preliminary sketches. Neither Elias nor Cross was found among the living or the dead. The search turned up nothing save for a burned metal clasp, the kind that might have held a sketchbook shut, buried in the ash. The townspeople grieved, the parish rebuilt, and in time the story of the fire became a cautionary tale about the fragility of life and the cruelty of fate. But for those who had seen Elias's drawings, fate had nothing to do with it. The fire had been composed long before the first spark, and somewhere beyond the reach of the town's grief, two figures walked away from the ruins carrying with them the knowledge that they had orchestrated death, not by chance, but by design. Years passed before his name surfaced again, and by then Elias Hartwell was no longer a boy. It was 1897 in Philadelphia, a city swollen with factories, alleys, and the restless tide of strangers. The police began investigating a series of murders so peculiar that even hardened detectives spoke of them only behind closed doors. Victims were found in public places, an alley off Market Street, the balcony of a theater, the shadowed aisle of a church, each arranged in a posture too deliberate to be the work of panic or rage. The positions were unnatural yet precise, as if their bodies had been measured, posed, and left as part of some unspoken display. Whispers spread when a newspaper printed a single grainy photograph from one of the scenes. An art student claimed she recognized the arrangement, not from life, but from an old set of sketches she had seen years earlier, in a portfolio owned by a gaunt, silent man who sat drawing by the lamplight near her boarding house. She described him as having pale eyes that made the paper under his hand look darker, and a manner of working so calm it seemed nothing around him could break his concentration. In the weeks that followed, other witnesses came forward with similar accounts, always of a tall, thin figure with a weathered sketchbook and a gaze that moved slowly from person to person as though selecting. None of these sightings were officially tied to the murders, but among the detectives a rumor took hold. The killer wasn't reacting to opportunity but following plans laid long before the victims crossed his path. The few surviving relatives of the parish fire recognized the descriptions, though none dared speak Elias's name aloud. And then, just as suddenly as the killings had begun, they stopped. The city breathed easier. The case faded into the backlog, and the man with the sketchbook vanished once more. But in the basement of the police archive, locked in a drawer and marked as evidence for an unsolved case, sat a thin folio of drawings retrieved from one of the crime scenes. The pages were brittle with age, the ink smudged in places, but every figure was clear. Their faces and postures matched exactly to the dead found across the city. At the bottom of the last page, in a hand as steady as ever, was a single set of initials, E.H. By the turn of the century, Elias Hartwell's story had slipped from active investigation into the uneasy realm of whispered legend. In Pennsylvania's smaller towns, his name became a warning told to children of the quiet man who could trap you in a picture and make the world bend to match it. But the truth never stayed buried for long. In 1904, a young constable in Lancaster uncovered a sealed box during an inventory of abandoned evidence. Inside were sketches spanning decades, some dated as far back as the mid-1850s. The paper had yellowed, the edges frayed, but the images retained a disturbing clarity. These were not random works. They formed a lineage of death scenes, rural and urban, solitary and in groups, each executed with the same unnatural order, the same unshakable symmetry. Among them were drawings from the parish fire, the Philadelphia murders, and several killings that had never been reported publicly. A few even depicted people who were still alive at the time the sketches were dated, only to be confirmed dead years later in poses identical to the images. The implication was impossible to ignore. Elias had been active, uninterrupted for over half a century. The constable, unnerved, brought the fine to his superiors, but the box was quietly returned to storage and sealed again, this time under the label of occult materials. Officially, it was dismissed as the work of a morbid fantasist, unconnected to any real crimes. Unofficially, those who saw the drawings refused to speak of them in daylight. One clerk resigned rather than continue working in the building where the box was kept. In time, the sketches were moved to the archives of a private collector in Harrisburg, who claimed they belonged in his library of American curiosities. From there, the trail went cold. Yet over the next decades, reports surfaced in cities as far apart as Chicago and Boston. Stories of an old man with a thin frame and pale eyes, seen sketching alone in public spaces. Always, within days, someone from that place would be found dead, their body posed like something from a frame already drawn. Whether Elias Hartwell was still alive or whether someone had inherited his work, no one could say. But the design, the ritual, was still in motion. By the 1920s, the murders attributed quietly and without official acknowledgement to Elias Hartwell had taken on a new form. They no longer followed only the solitary, isolated compositions of earlier decades. Instead, they appeared as public tableaux, arrangements so brazen they seemed almost theatrical. In New York City, 4 bodies were discovered, on the stage of an abandoned opera house, each seated in a velvet chair. Hands resting on their knees, their heads tilted at identical angles toward the empty conductor's stand. In New Orleans, 3 dock workers were found on the pier at dawn, arranged in a perfect triangle. Ropes looped around their necks but not drawn tight, as if the act had been interrupted. Yet all were dead without a mark inside or out. Whispers among police investigators suggested a revival of Hartwell's work. But there was something different about these new displays. They were grander, more elaborate, as though the hand behind them had more resources and no fear of discovery. Those who studied the scenes noticed details invisible to the public. A child's toy placed near one victim's feet, a small bird skull balanced on windowsill, the faint impression of burned paper on a table near another. These were echoes of Hartwell's earliest rituals, the subtle marks that had once tied his private sketches to the public dead. The question became whether the man himself was still alive, or if someone else, perhaps Dr. Nathaniel Cross, if he had also escaped the fire, had continued the work. One retired detective from Philadelphia claimed to have seen Hartwell in 1922, standing at the far end of a railway platform, sketchbook open, his frame stooped but his hands steady. The detective swore the drawing showed a steam locomotive crossing the bridge into the city, with the silhouettes of passengers leaning out the windows. 3 days later, the train derailed on that very bridge. Several of the dead were found positioned across the wreckage in patterns too deliberate to be chance. Still, no arrest was ever made, and the killings remained scattered in location but unified in design. Those who knew of the sketches began to believe that the ritual had evolved beyond Hartwell himself, that the drawings had become instructions anyone could follow, provided they understood the order in which the world must be arranged. If that were true, then the line between artist and killer had blurred completely, and Hartwell's work would outlive him, passed hand to hand like a blueprint for death. By the 1940s, the killings had become rare but unmistakable, fewer in number, yet each one so exact in composition that those who still guarded the memory of Elias Hartwell recognized his signature instantly. The Second World War gave cover for much of it. Sudden death was everywhere, and bodies arranged in strange positions could be dismissed as the chaos of bombing or the work of enemy sabotage. But in quiet pockets far from the front lines, deaths occurred that had no wartime logic at all. In a small town outside Pittsburgh, 3 members of the same family were found seated around their dining table. Their heads bowed over empty plates, their hands clasped as if in prayer. There was no food, no spilled drink, and no sign of struggle. The only thing on the table was a single sheet of paper face down. When turned over, it revealed a detailed drawing of the scene exactly as it was found, every fold in the tablecloth, every crease in the victim's clothes, signed in that same deliberate hand. E.H. In San Francisco, a longshoreman was discovered in a warehouse, lying on his back atop a crate, his arms crossed over his chest and his boots placed neatly beside him. The coroner reported no cause of death. The police found tucked under the crate a half-burned piece of thick drawing paper. What remained showed the outline of the warehouse wall, the curve of the man's jaw, and the exact position of his bare feet. By now, even those who dismissed the old stories began to admit there was something unshakable about the pattern. The arrangement of the dead was too consistent, too deliberate for chance. A few whispered that Hartwell's sketches had been scattered in the world like seeds, each one capable of taking root in the mind of someone willing or compelled to make it real. If that was true, the killer did not need to survive. The work would go on in other hands in other cities across other decades. And yet in 1949, a woman in Chicago swore she saw him. He was standing in the back of a crowded streetcar, sketching intently, his pale eyes flicking between the passengers and the page. When she glanced at his work, she claimed it showed the interior of the streetcar exactly as it was, except the passengers were motionless, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, and a thin trail of smoke curled through the windows. 2 nights later, that same streetcar caught fire in the depot, killing everyone aboard. If it was Elias Hartwell, he would have been well into his 90s. But age seemed irrelevant to the figure in her description. What mattered was the steadiness of the hand, and the way the world still bent itself to match what it had drawn. By the 1960s, Hartwell's name had faded almost entirely from public memory, surviving only in the locked files of certain police departments and in the whispered exchanges between a handful of archivists, detectives, and coroners who had studied the pattern. The killings were now decades apart, but each arrival felt like the reappearance of a ghost that had never aged. In 1963, a crime scene in rural Maine brought those whispers surging back. A family of 5 was found in their living room, each seated in a different chair, all facing the same bare patch of wall. Their eyes had been removed with surgical precision, and in their place the sockets had been filled with small, polished stones. No blood, no signs of struggle. The only item in the room not belonging to the family was an old wooden frame leaning against the wall they faced. Inside was not a painting, but a sketch, so detailed it seemed impossible it could have been completed before the bodies were found. But it had been. The signature at the bottom was faint, smudged, but still legible. E.H. 2 years later, in Detroit, an abandoned tenement was discovered to contain a room filled wall-to-wall with pinned sketches, each one depicting a death scene from the past century. Some were recognizable from old police photographs. Others showed events no one could confirm had ever happened. And in the center of the room, on a single wooden chair, sat the corpse of a man who appeared to be in his late 90s. Emaciated, hands folded, eyes closed. No identification. His sketchbook, lying open on the floor beside him, contained one final image. A man seated in a wooden chair, hands folded, eyes closed. Authorities could not confirm it was Hartwell. The body was too degraded for certain identification, and no fingerprints were on record. The case was quietly closed, the sketches archived, and the name Elias Hartwell was again allowed to sink into obscurity. But in the years that followed, scattered deaths appeared in New York, Montreal, and even London, each one posed with the same unnatural symmetry, each preceded by a sighting of a thin, pale-eyed stranger drawing in a public place. If Hartwell was truly dead, someone else had taken the book, and if he was alive, age had not dulled the accuracy of his hand, only refined it, distilling his work into something quieter, rarer, and perhaps even more dangerous. The drawings were no longer just predictions or instructions. They had become heirlooms, passed from death to death, each one preserving the unbroken ritual of creation before destruction. By the late 1970s, the murders had grown so infrequent they almost escaped notice. Isolated deaths scattered across countries, each too far apart in time and place to connect in public records. But those who still tracked the pattern, the hidden network of archivists, retired detectives, and medical examiners who traded information in private, saw the same hand guiding them. The arrangements were subtler now, less theatrical, yet somehow more unsettling for their restraint. In 1978, a man was found in a London boarding house, seated at his writing desk with his pen still in hand. His body was upright, his posture perfect, his eyes lowered to a blank sheet of paper. There was no sign of violence, no struggle, and the ink in the pen was dry. The coroner marked it as heart failure. But weeks later, a private investigator looking into the case came across a sketch in an antique shop's back room. It was the same scene, same desk, same posture, even the same pen, drawn with such precision that the shading of the desk's wood grain matched exactly. In 1981, 3 hikers disappeared in the Italian Alps. Months later, their bodies were discovered in a mountain cave, seated shoulder to shoulder, each holding a small bundle of wild flowers in their laps. A folded sheet of paper was pinned to the cave wall behind them, protected inside a wax-sealed envelope. The drawing inside depicted the exact arrangement of the hikers, down to the tilt of their heads and the uneven distribution of petals in each bouquet. No footprints or equipment were found, only the drawing. By now the question had shifted. It was no longer just, is Hartwell alive? But has the ritual become larger than the man? Those who studied the history believed the sketches had become a set of living instructions, whether held by Hartwell, Dr. Cross, or someone else entirely, that could be followed by anyone willing to obey their quiet, rigid order. The killings had become less about the hand that drew and more about the persistence of the method itself. A design that could leap across generations without losing a single detail. And in 1984, when a woman in Prague claimed to have seen an elderly man on a park bench sketching the skyline with uncanny speed. She swore there was something wrong with the picture. The buildings were right, the light was right. But in the drawing there were no people walking the streets, only their bodies lying perfectly still. 2 days later, a gas explosion tore through that very street. Every casualty was found in the exact position she had seen in the sketch. By the early 2000s, the killings had taken on a ghost-like quality, appearing suddenly in places far removed from each other with years of silence in between. Most never made the news, dismissed as freak accidents or left unexplained in closed case files. Yet every so often a photograph would surface, never in the press, always in private channels, of a death scene so unnaturally precise that those who knew the history felt the same cold recognition. In 2003, a commuter ferry in Washington state was found adrift at dawn, all 23 passengers dead in their seats. They were arranged in perfect alternating rows of upright and slightly reclined bodies, as if following some invisible pattern. On the captain's table was a single sheet of vellum paper, weighted down by a coffee mug. The drawing on it was flawless, the angle of each head, the slight curve of the shoreline through the ferry windows. At the bottom, faint and neat, the initials E.H. In 2011, a derelict apartment in Buenos Aires was raided after neighbors complained of a strange smell. Inside, the walls were covered floor to ceiling with pinned sketches, some so old the paper had browned and curled. In the center of the room, a dining table was set for 6. 5 chairs were occupied by desiccated corpses in formal attire, their poses matching one of the pinned drawings exactly. The 6th chair was empty, but in front of it lay a fresh sketchbook, its first page showing the same table, now with all 6 seats filled. Interpol quietly took possession of the sketches, but within months, 2 agents assigned to the case were found dead in a Paris hotel room, their bodies posed like mirrored reflections of each other. The sketches had vanished. By this point, even the most skeptical investigators began to admit the possibility that the work was no longer bound to a single person's lifespan. Whether Elias Hartwell himself had lived impossibly long or whether the drawings had been handed down through careful secretive succession, the outcome was the same. The ritual endured. The same patience, the same unbroken rule. The drawing came first, and the world followed. And in 2019, in a quiet museum archive in Pennsylvania, a curator cataloging unclaimed estate donations opened a rolled portfolio. Inside were 32 sketches, each depicting a different public location in exacting detail. The disturbing part wasn't the precision. It was the fact that by the end of that year, 5 of those locations had become the sites of sudden, unexplained mass deaths, each victim arranged exactly as drawn. By 2023, the pattern had begun to re-emerge with a frequency that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The deaths spanned continents, linked only by the precision of their arrangements, and in a few cases, the quiet appearance of a pale-eyed figure seen sketching in public days before the event. Surveillance cameras caught him twice. Once in Kyoto, seated outside a tea shop with a heavy-bound sketchbook on his lap, and once in Oslo perched on a park bench in winter, drawing despite the falling snow. Both videos were grainy, but the posture was identical, the movement slow and unbroken, as if each line carried a weight that could not be rushed. The Kyoto sighting preceded a commuter train disaster. The wreck left 30 dead, each body found within the train cars in perfect symmetry, paired in twos along the seats, alternating head positions as though aligned to an unseen diagram. The Oslo sighting was followed by a hotel fire that claimed 17 lives, all discovered in their beds, hands folded across their chests, every blanket tucked to the same exact height. In both cases, investigators found no sketches at the scene, but photographs leaked from anonymous sources showed folded sheets of vellum recovered from undisclosed locations nearby. Drawings that matched the deaths with impossible precision. International agencies attempted to treat the incidents as unrelated, wary of public panic. Yet among archivists and private researchers who had been tracing the Hartwell line for decades, the conclusion was unavoidable. Either the original artist still walked the earth, or the method had been passed intact through generations. Its rules never altered. The work had adapted to the age, silent, mobile, invisible until the moment of revelation. In late autumn of that year, a digital photograph surfaced briefly on a dark web auction site before disappearing. It showed a clean, unlined desk with a single open sketchbook. The page depicted a large modern lecture hall filled with people seated in curved rows. Every head was turned toward the center, where a lone figure stood at a podium. 2 weeks later, in a university in Boston, that exact lecture hall was found sealed from the inside. Every person inside was dead, their bodies arranged exactly as the drawing had shown. The figure at the podium was missing. Those who saw the leaked image understood something more chilling than the deaths themselves. Someone wanted the sketch seen, not hidden. The ritual was no longer content with secrecy. It was sending a message. By early 2025, the message became impossible to ignore. A series of killings occurred in such quick succession that they felt less like isolated acts and more like coordinated exhibitions. São Paulo, Marrakesh, Vancouver, Istanbul, 4 cities in 4 weeks, each crime scene bearing the same eerie hallmarks. In each, the dead were arranged in elaborate, almost architectural formations, as if their bodies were components in a larger structure only visible from above. In São Paulo, 32 victims were discovered in an abandoned textile mill, their positions forming a near-perfect spiral when viewed from the rafters. In Marrakesh, a marketplace was emptied in the dead of night. Every merchant found the next morning propped behind their own stalls, heads bowed toward their wares as if in reverence. In Vancouver, 12 victims lay in a straight line across a rain-slick pier, each with one hand extended toward the water. And in Istanbul, inside the Hagia Sophia, 9 tourists were found kneeling side by side in the shadow of a column, their foreheads resting against the stone. In every case, the positioning was exact, down to the smallest asymmetry, an angle of a foot, a tilt of the jaw, that could only be replicated from a visual reference. In 3 of the 4 cities, sketches were recovered from anonymous drop points nearby. None were signed, but the precision, the stillness, and the unbroken lineage of style left no doubt. This was Hartwell's work, or the work of whoever now carried his book. For the first time, the pattern drew coordinated attention from global agencies. An internal report by Interpol's Cultural and Occult Crimes Division concluded that the killings were no longer the output of a single traveling hand, but of multiple practitioners working from the same archive. The Hartwell method, as they called it, had become a doctrine, a set of rules followed to the letter, passed in secret like a sacred text. The most disturbing finding came from the Istanbul scene. Hidden inside one victim's coat pocket was a folded sheet of modern sketch paper. On it, in crisp, controlled lines, was a city skyline not yet realized, towers still under construction, an empty square where crowds would one day gather. At the center of that square, dozens of human figures lay in symmetrical collapse. In the bottom margin, for the first time in over a century, appeared the initials again, written in steady black ink. E.H. It was not just the persistence of the ritual that unsettled the investigators. It was the confirmation that whoever held the book wanted them to know the next scene was already planned, and that they would not be able to stop it. In the spring of 2025, the warning took form. The skyline from the Istanbul sketch was identified as belonging to a new public plaza in Warsaw, Poland. An architectural project still in its final stages of construction. Authorities discreetly increased security, installing cameras limiting public access and placing plainclothes officers in the surrounding streets. For weeks, nothing happened. The plaza opened without incident. The crowds came and went, and the fear that had coiled inside the investigation began to loosen. Then, on the morning of May 19th, the square was found empty. Not evacuated, empty. Every person who had entered between 7 a.m. and 7:15 a.m. was discovered lying in perfect symmetry across the stone, their bodies forming two vast concentric circles around the central fountain. The arrangement was so precise that the distance between each corpse's outstretched hand and the next was identical to the centimeter. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, no evidence of gas or poison. In the exact center of the fountain, weighed down by a small stone, floated a waterproof tube. Inside was a fresh sheet of paper. The drawing matched the scene flawlessly, not just the positions but the individual features of each victim, as though they had been studied beforehand. At the bottom was a single unsettling addition, a faint, careful line of handwriting that read, "The composition is never finished." The Warsaw incident marked the first time the Hartwell method had been executed under such heavy surveillance without a single recording of the act itself. The footage from every camera inside the square simply froze between 7:02 and 7:14, resuming as if nothing had happened. Analysts could find no sign of tampering, no digital interference. And yet every clock in the surrounding blocks was confirmed to have stopped for exactly those 12 minutes. For those who had been following the pattern across decades, it was the final confirmation of what they had long feared. This was no longer bound by human limits of time, place, or even mortality. The drawings were not just blueprints, they were permissions, and whatever force had honored them for nearly 2 centuries had grown beyond the need for secrecy. 2 weeks later, in an anonymous online forum that had tracked Hartwell's sightings for years, a single post appeared from an untraceable account. It was an image, high resolution, stark, and impossible to mistake. A drawing of a crowded international airport terminal, every traveler lying perfectly still on the polished floor. The departure boards in the sketch showed a date 3 months in the future. The truth of Elias Hartwell's life was never carved in stone, only in paper, graphite, and the silent obedience of the world that followed his lines. Official records reduced him to rumor, his name erased from public memory, his works locked away or lost. Yet the pattern endured. Across centuries, continents, and changing technologies, the same unbroken law held. The drawing came first, the death followed. Whether it was the hand of Hartwell himself, impossibly surviving into each new era, or a chain of others carrying his book like a sacred trust, no one could prove. No one could stop it. Those who had studied the method longest understood its quiet genius. It was not chaos. It was not rage. It was patience. Every line was placed with intention, every shadow a decision. Death, in Hartwell's design, was not the end. It was the completion of a composition. The living were only material, their final poses waiting in the folds of a sketchbook no one could keep for long. Wars ended, cities rose and fell, and still the work appeared, sometimes in years, sometimes in decades, like a ghost testing the boundaries of the world. Some of the drawings have never been found, some have not yet happened. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. The method is never finished. Each blank page is a space for the next scene, each silence between killings a pause in the artist's hand, not a surrender. In the end, Elias Hartwell was not remembered as a man, but as a process, a set of rules that made death into a still life and turned the living into its unwitting subjects. If the book still exists, somewhere it is being opened, a page turned, a line placed on paper that will one day find its echo in the flesh. What do you think? Could this happen again?